So my pleasure to welcome, for what is your debut on the Medics Money podcast, Dr. Katie Bramall-Stainer, the chair of the BMA General Practice Committee. Hi, Katie.
Hello, thank you for having me. It's really exciting.
Yeah, so first time on the Medics Money podcast, but not your first podcast, although I should point out that Medics Money is the biggest podcast for doctors in the UK with 1.2 million downloads right now. But you're used to speaking to like international media organizations, politicians. So we thought, let's make this a bit more challenging for you by having a live audience. So we are recording in front of a live audience of GP partners from our Medics Money GP Partnership course, and they have submitted some questions to ask you. So thank you so much for giving up your time in what must be a really hectic schedule. And shall we just get straight into it? We've got lots of GPs listening, but we've probably got some non-GP listeners to our podcast as well. So how did you become the chair of the BMA GPC?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. Second, this is less of a podcast, more of a Viva by the sounds of it. But I'll give it my best shot. I'm not the big finance person, so forgive me if I come a cropper. How did I become chair of the GPC? Well, there was a democratic election of the whole committee. It's as boring as that. I got involved in medical politics, first of all with representation of kind of student activities. I was General Secretary of UCL Student Union. That's the kind of crazy stuff that I got up to at medical school, very exciting. But all of that stuff around standing orders and elections and getting everything right in committee structures and corporate governance was incredibly valuable, better than the Krebs cycle. And yeah, and I chaired the Medical Students Conference in 2003, and I thought, oh well, that's me done for a bit of BMA fun and games, because I was qualifying. And then I started my house jobs and was working illegal rotas, and so got involved in my local regional junior doctors committee. And because I was the only other person that rocked up, I became the secretary to the other guy who was the chair, and found myself on the national committee. And then got embroiled over time with MTAS, the Modernising Medical Careers, that absolutely massively impacted my generation. And then that kind of led into a leadership role for GP registrars. And then I carried on a seat on GPC for sessional GPs, then as a young, newly qualified partner, raising issues such as the lack of parental leave reimbursement, and also the issue of the departure from the workforce of younger female GPs. And actually, you know, on this occasion, my soothsaying was proven correct around the attrition of the workforce and the massive issues coming towards us. I vocalised quite formally, actually, in a big paper back in 2014. And I'm very sad to say that much of that has come true. So I do feel somewhat of a Cassandra, but I'm actually now not a younger voice on the committee. I'm now one of the slightly, I would say, middling to older ones, and find myself one of the most experienced members of the committee. But the nice thing about my deputy chairs is that, you know, Samira and David and Julius, we've all actually been on GPC a very long time. This is not our first rodeo, and I hope that comes across to the profession, that we hope we know what we're doing. We're trying very hard to do the very best we can. Otherwise, what is the point of doing this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure I speak for the profession when I say it definitely comes across how, like, I'm blown away by how good you guys are, especially at speaking to the media. That would just like freak me out. Like, okay, this is a largest podcast and it's not a Viva, we're all friends. But yeah, thank you for everything that you do, because it cannot be easy to do that. And I'm a bit alarmed that you consider yourself not young anymore, because it sounds like we could have been at UCL. I started UCL in year 2000, so we might be a similar age. We're in our prime, not old, like you said. We're maturing like fine wines and not cheese.
That was the year I was General Secretary. That's why it was so good, Tommy. Because the year you started as a fresher was the year I was General Secretary of the Union. So any positives you got from that year are wholly and exclusively attributable to my leadership of the Students' Union, I think you'll find.
Freshers Week in that union was absolutely excellent. So that's something else that I need to thank you for. But let's not talk about that today, because it's probably best that that stays in the Student Union. And you're right. You know, we don't want to get too bogged in on the finances, but it is called Medics Money. So the first question is going to be about money, and we've just had Rachel Reeves's budget. So I think Andy wanted to ask you a question about Guess what? National insurance.
Yeah, hi Katie. So this has been the big topic for about the last week, really. So the question is, that's come in the past 2 years, NHS of England uplifted the global sum in response to the government saying staff costs should rise, but it failed to deliver sufficient funding in those two uplifts. Given the rise in national insurance costs and the minimum wage levels next year announced in the budget, what needs to change to ensure the formula delivers the correct level of funding now to general practice going forward?
Well, to my mind, unless government comes up with a rapid solution to reimburse practices, I personally think we need a new contract with a formula that works. Because at the moment, the winners and the losers, the variation is far too disparate. And the biggest challenge that's facing partners today is being able to keep their practices open. We've had decades of underfunding, and it's going to have to be sorted out, because practice funding isn't just through global sum anymore. It's more complicated than that. My real worry is about reimbursements. And the other thing we need to be prepared for, because I can well imagine, because you've got to put yourself in other parties' minds, haven't you? If I were NHS England, I would say, and if I had the Department of Health saying, how are you going to make reimbursements work? I would be thinking, well, hang on, we've got these PCN test pilots going on. We're spending a lot of money getting their workforce data. I know, maybe we could agree to reimbursements if we make it compulsory on a practice by practice basis that we get everyone's GP practice payroll data. I mean, that would be, NHS England would love that. They're paying a lot to get that from the current PCN test pilot sites. So that's something we have to think about. But, on top of that, with the national insurance increases, with the lack of clarity over the exemptions, with Treasury deciding to take an extremely hard line over OBR definitions, which is my understanding, then I think this is absolutely dreadful position. And I don't feel this can or should be part of the 25-26 contract negotiations. You will perhaps notice that yesterday, depending upon when you're listening to this podcast, on a morning breakfast news program, the Secretary of State said, oh, we'll be in negotiations. No, this isn't a negotiation. I am not going to negotiate that you're going to take hundreds of millions away from us and then reimburse it through a really flawed mechanism. So ultimately, this decision is a political decision, and it threatens the viability of every practice in this country, and therefore the livelihoods of not only the partners running the practice, but also the staff that they employ. We can't up our prices. We're not like a hospice or a care home or a social care enterprise or a pharmacy. We can't up our prices. Therefore, we're going to have to diminish our services or diminish our staff. And how is that going to bring back the family doctor? How is that going to provide greater levels of care in the community? How is that going to take the focus away from expensive acutes that we keep on funding? So I'm trying to put back to government all of the promises that they've brought forward, and I think I've made it quite clear, and I've made it clear in the HSJ, Wes Streeting is not going to want to go on record as being the Labour Health Secretary that ended up privatising general practice, as happened to community dentistry. Surely, and yet that is an actual potential risk we can see, because if we're definitely private, not public, then I think some official legal questions need to be asked here. And also in the context of the fact we have a contract which precludes our being able to treat our registered patients privately. So where are the legalities or the lawfulness around that? So actually, I can't help but feel this is a real bee's nest, wasp's nest, even a wasp's nest that's been shaken here. And it could have been so simple. It could have been so simple, but it's not. And you may well say, well, hang on, what about Treasury? And initially, I think with Darren Jones's comments on Question Time, I was like, hang on. But from Rachel Reeves' perspective, she is probably saying, to waste treating. Well, look, I promised you, I've committed 22.6 billion over the next 2 years. What you do with that is up to you. So the pressure is on, but the pressure has got to be on the Department of Health and the Secretary of State, because this comes down to a political decision. And those political decisions are going to mean that practices sink or swim. And so it is not a negotiation. This has to be a solution that must be found.
And just sort of following up on that, do you think they'll move quick enough? Because I mean, my inbox has just been full of very concerned practices the last few days, because they can see one side of the equation, they can see the cost, they can predict that, and they're all going away predicting it and getting some really horrible figures. And at the moment, we've just got on the other side a promise that, you know, it will be considered, but we can't get, as we have done the last couple of years, late until the 31st of March to get some figures available. This is what you're going to get next year. Otherwise, it's going to cause major problems over the next, you know, through winter. Do you see any sign of them actually moving quickly on this one this time?
I've had conversations at every single level of government over the past 5 or 6 days. And the one thing that has absolutely been understood are the timelines. The GPC England executive meets tomorrow morning. The National Committee meets next Thursday morning. The National Conference meets on Friday the 22nd. At any of those junctures, you can have escalations of action. You can have patience to a point. But you're absolutely right, Andy. This can't be just floating in the ether, having tit for tat week after week, because practices need to be able to plan their finances, understand what their capital is going to be going into the new financial year, make decisions accordingly, and look at the timing. You know, the uplifts from DDRB have now landed, and they've landed with a bit of confusion. And as we all predicted, the same problems where some do okay and some really don't do okay, because global sum is so flawed, because CAHL is so flawed. And those practices now, if they're going to be fiscally responsible and they're well managed and they're well run, which they are because they can't have a deficit, those practices are now going to be looking at their lines and thinking, well, actually, can we afford to uplift people's pay in good faith going with DDRB if we're then going to be hammered again? I mean, it's so toxic, and practices have got to make the right decision for their budget lines. And they're going to be some very hard choices. And that's why it's so important to publicise what those choices are going to be and what those figures look like. And, you know, that's why online calculators are so helpful. The BMA is trying to work up. I know we've chatted, Andy, briefly around something quite substantive that's probably going to be a bit tricky for PMs and finance partners to be doing, but will be imperative to be able to spell out what this is. Because if the government's serious about access to a GP, well, that access is going to be diminished if you have to let go a certain proportion of your reception team or your patient navigation team, or even, you know, when it comes down to it, I'm really worried about we have so many less than full-time staff around practices because we've got such long opening hours and it's so intensive. And when you've got lots of less than full-time staff, they tend to be female. So what about that gender pay gap? And when you're looking at CAHL and you're looking at global sum, we know it particularly doesn't work in deprived communities. So this is going to be further impacting those exact communities the Labour Party are particularly passionate, they say, about supporting. So on every level, intellectual, ideological, political, social, this isn't working. And so that's why I think the pressure really is on them. And we have to be unequivocal about the impact of this. And the National Committee, which reflects the national profession, is incandescent. And LMCs, where there's 365 reps that go to the national conference on the 22nd of November, they're absolutely up in arms. And so I think we are going to see, in the absence of any immediate clarity from government, we're going to see the ramping up, because this for me feels like an end game. This for me feels like an absolute, we've crossed the Rubicon. This is big. And we cannot diminish the importance of this and how serious and grave it is.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, we could probably talk about this for the next hour because, it's just the biggest issue by far. But I guess we've got a few more questions to ask, so perhaps some slightly easier ones. But I suspect looking at them, some of them aren't so easy.
Sorry, can I just leave back on that one just to follow up on that? So we're recording this on the 6th of November. And I really, maybe this podcast is going to come out in a month or two, a week or two. I really hope that this goes out of date and is all sorted by the time the podcast is put out. 2, absolutely right. GP partners, you're a business owner, you're running a business. You need to model what this costs you. And when you do, I don't think you'll be, that might bring it home to you. And inside the Medics Money community, we have a spreadsheet that Andy built, expert accountant. You can run your numbers through that because each of us, as we are running businesses, our businesses is to help people and make them better. It's the best business that I've ever been in, but it is a business and we can't go into debt like the trusts, because if a GP practice goes into debt, my house is on the line and my personal assets are on the line. So it is my fiscal responsibility to use the spreadsheet that we have, and happy to share that with the BMA if that's useful so that everyone can benefit. And to your point about time of the essence here. So in my practice, we've used Andy's spreadsheet, we've run the numbers, instantly implemented a hiring freeze, and we're having to model things out for next year because we need certainty and clarity on this right now. I am running a business where if I go into debt, my house is on the line. It's unlimited liability partnership, one of the perks of being a GP and one of the problems of the contract. So in a sense, it is already too late. Like, we are making plans right now that are impacting next year. So I really hope this segment goes out of date and it's all sorted. We'll see, I guess. Sorry, Andy, to cut in.
Yeah, absolutely, Tommy. I agree. I mean, I've walked the walk at home with a spouse who's a GP who handed back their contract a couple of years ago, and I can tell you it's the most unpleasant thing to do. Really not what we want to do as a family, not what we want to do as a practice, and let's hope it doesn't go in that direction. On the positive side, when I have been on podcasts before with you, Tommy, often we get changes come through. I don't think it's anything to do with me, it's just more luck of the game as to when they're actually recorded, but let's hope that happens. So we'll park that one because it is such a big issue and we've got other things to cover. The other thing that came out in the budget it was right down in the sort of small detail, was about some premises development reimbursement coming through. And the question we've got, and it comes up time and time again in our community, of people run out of space, they need to develop their premises. But the announcement was made that basically they're going to put some funding in case for 200 premises, and given there's 6,000 practices in the country at the moment, is that really just a drop in the ocean of what's now needed in terms of premises development going forward?
We've had decades of underinvestment, and if there's a genuine commitment to move care closer to home and out of the hospital model, you're going to need space to do that. And the demise of ETTF and the spreading of the ring-fenced primary care premises investment funds into the ICB premises funding has been a disaster, because on my patch, Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, where I'm the chief executive of the LMC, we have Adam Brooks that has a commitment to a new children's hospital on its biomedical campus. We have the brand new Papworth, big tertiary specialist trust. We have Hinchingbrook that's got the rack issue that desperately needs a new roof and expansion, and that's actually an issue across our whole region in the east of England. So the what's needed in our system, in our ICS, is about a third of the national budget. So this kind of puts into perspective that the big ticket items, and that's on the back, of course, of years ago and the announcement of the new hospitals and the rest of it, which aren't the new hospitals. It puts in perspective that the big ticket items always drown out. Goliath drowns out David, and yet 1.5 million consultations a day. So think about the front door to the NHS and the impact that could have, and the transformation that could have. So we've had very little detail about which premises will be developed, what the criteria for that is. But yeah, for 200 that's nothing. Now, is this 200 neighbourhood health centres? Is this actually their starter for 10 on the new neighbourhood model? What does that look like? What does it mean? Is it Darcy centres going back to 2007, which actually nowadays, there's been a big change in the intervening 20 years almost. if general practice were given the opportunity, and we put this in our patients first vision, why general practice is broken, how you fix it. Here's your solutions, government. Take it as a to-do kit. Here's your manual. You could actually wrap it around general practice. You could bring district nursing in-house, ambulatory care, health visiting, safeguarding, properly resource it in the way that community trusts are resourced. And we could do a really good job at a proper neighbourhood level. There's your hub, and then your spokes are going to be very much about personalised care led by your named GP. That's the model where the evidence lies that it would work brilliantly. But you look at the estate as it stands, and so many practices have got huge premises issues, sites that are too small to handle patient need, parts of the building unusable because they're literally dilapidating. Not just the logistics, but I think working in a comfortable and safe environment is really important for everyone's well-being. It's central to your workforce morale and to retention and recruitment. It's also vital for safe care, regulators, CQC, whatever, and to make sure that patients have the best possible experience in the surgery too. So, but yeah, where's our share of the capital budget is my question. So I think there are questions for us also to ask as a profession internally and to consider around, okay, if you get a neighbourhood system, what's that going to look like? How do we want it to work? How can we be helpful to this government and suggest solutions? Because when you are in negotiations, you do always want to try and seize the opportunities, because that's where your answers lie rather than the jeopardies. However, I've also got young partners in my system whose banks are not willing for them to be loaned the mortgage for their site, and they're asking the existing partners to be the guarantors, which kind of defeats the object of the exercise. So there's something here. There are discussions here. It needs to be reimbursed at cost, but there is something here that we have to think, not just the short term, but also the medium and long term. Where are we going with premises developments? There's a big question to ask there. But in terms of the here and the now, 200 practices, do me a favour. So I'm thinking, is that 200 for a political thing? Is it the 200 neighbourhood health centres and this is how they're going to start? We don't know. No one said anything. And what's clear from whatever has been published is I don't think the government has yet made up its mind. But the one thing we know we don't have a lot of is capital investment. But then we've also just had Rachel Reeves give 22.6 billion to the NHS over 2 years. So it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, I think they also now, I think it was something like a 3 billion capital investment in the NHS, and this is something like 100 million. So I think it just backs up what you've just said there in terms of the proportion between, big ticket hospitals versus small general practice is just, it's skewed far too far towards one side. So I think we'll move off the budget now, and I'm going to hand back to Tommy, who's got the next question, I think.
Yeah, so the next question is about locally enhanced services, and locally enhanced services are a hot topic in our GP partnership course community, because what we've got loads of GP partners from all over the country, combined with the best experts in the business, all helping those partners and teaching them how to, improve their practices, how to run their businesses essentially. And all those partners chat to each other in our in-person events, which are happening on Friday. Sad that you couldn't make it there, Katie. And also on our online community. And when they chat to each other, they say, okay, locally enhanced services, these are really valuable to the NHS. They're really valuable to patients. And yet, first point is that the funding has been static in 80% of areas, according to the BMJ recently, when we know that costs have gone up. And Sarah's just dropped in the chat a really good point that, employment costs have gone up, but the rates of pay for these enhanced services have been static for a long, long time. So, fiscal drag, the freezing of reimbursement is really painful. That's the first point. But the second more annoying point, and something maybe I'd be interested to know what the BMA think about this, is that the differences in what people are paid by ICB to ICB are absolutely wild. Some areas are doing ECGs essentially for free. Some have a locally enhanced service that pays £2 per ECG, absolute joke. Some people have one pays like £15. And to give you a specific example, in my ICB, we have a locally enhanced service for monitoring CLL and MGUS patients. So I'm semi-rural, and these patients are usually quite old and quite frail. So going to the hospital is a big deal for them. And so we monitor their bloods in the community. It saves them a trip to hospital. It saves the hospital a ton of money. It saves a consultant hematologist or similar seeing them, because we just, we're happy to take on this enhanced work, and we get £92.40 for that. In another ICB, well, some other ICBs don't even have an enhanced service for that. They're just doing the work for free, effectively partners paying to do that work. But in another ICB, the service specification is almost identical to mine, and they get £45. So there's this huge differential. It's become a postcode lottery, not just for partners in terms of funding, but of course that pushes into a postcode lottery for patients, because as Sarah said in the chat, the costs, the juice isn't worth the squeeze in a lot of things. So what can the BMA do about trying to make these enhanced services more fair and less of a postcode lottery?
This is a discussion I was having all day yesterday within CAMS LMC. It's a massive issue. Complex dressings, a really good example. Norfolk and Waveney, £119.93 annually, whereas I think it's like £19 per attendance in Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland. I think it's like £11.63 or something in Cambridgeshire. The variation is insane. Now, all of this goes back to the PMS contract review and the 7-year demise and the capital that was released from the PMS baseline funding, which I'm sure you know all of this, Tommy and Andy, but for the benefit of any listener who might not understand where all this has come from. So this is local discussions around local contracts that was based upon the amount of money released and then had to be reinvested in year with no rollover at 100% opportunity for every practice across that CCG. And that's why the baselines were largely fixed, and is why, in terms of once they'd all gone through the contract review. So in my own system, it was 5.9 million or something like that. And so what we've got, as you quite rightly say, is CCGs have become ICBs, but the figures have not changed. And we are looking at commissioners wanting to buy more for less and less and less, before you even factor in, as you say, the fiscal drag of the past 8 years. We've also got this postcode lottery across the 42 systems. And I just want to thank Gareth Iacobucci at the BMJ for his brilliant piece of work, his FOIs, his writing to every system, his liaising with LMCs. This is a germ of an idea that he had a couple of years ago, and it's taken this long to get to fruition. And there's some really important messaging in that article. And I think, Medics Money need to almost pin it onto your website. It's essential reading for every new partner. So LESers are local, and NHS England would say, well, that's all to do with the ICB. That's delegated. That's entirely up to them. But of course, we know that so many of these locally enhanced services are now essential for patient care. Are we going to stop ECGs? Are we going to stop, we can't just do that. So the question we have had, though, which is what we have suggested in collective action, is that it's looking at the bottom line. It's understanding where are your costs. Don't just look at your income. If you might be a really big practice, you might be getting a 6-figure sum from your locally enhanced services. And let's also not forget, because I practice in Hertfordshire, and in Hertfordshire we have the enhanced commissioning framework. So everything is bundled together into one basket. So it's very much a binary yes or no. And practices are fearful that if they can't do one bit, they'll get a remedial notice that they're not going to get paid for all of it, or some other silly threats like that. So we have to also think, well, what are the needs in that population? You mentioned rurality there, Tommy, and that's a really important thing. Also demography. If you've got a very elderly population, then your MGUS or your frailty is going to be more important than potentially your, chlamydia or other public health initiatives or smoking cessation with a younger population. So it is determined and predicated on the needs of the local population, and a national contract can't do everything, but there are things that go in LESers that should be in the national contract. ECGs, spirometry, minor ops, treatment room basic things. I know we've all probably all of us have been on a kind of Dante's seventh circle of hell conversation at some point about the commissioning of local ear syringing services. But this is really important, and they matter to patients and they matter to the system for the reasons you've said. We've seen treatment tariffs of prices with our local community diagnostic centres, the CDCs, which popped up under the last government, where they're commissioning phlebotomy for about £16 a bleed, but it's £2.22 for GPs. And we think, well, we're not mugs. Look at the scale. So bring it back to collective action. There is the potential here to look at your bottom line, to look and see how much this is costing your staff per hour, your consumables, your income. So even if you're getting a six-figure sum, if what's going out is a six-figure sum plus 20 grand, you are still 20 grand worse off for delivering all those services. You are paying your commissioner to deliver all those services. And the only way you can enforce a different conversation, a different funding stream, is to serve notice on that contract. And that is completely legal. That's completely fine. It is a clause in your contract. To serve notice, you must give written notice this many weeks. And I think that's where LMCs can be very helpful. They can unite areas. And I think Yorkshire LMC is doing this right now, which is a very big patch with a very big LES budget. So this is about how we can try and take control, but it's not easy. It's not going to be done for you. So a lot of collective action, we can frame it, but practices and LMCs and groups of practices and localities are going to have to put the hard yards in, because nothing's going to be given to us under a silver cloche of here's everything, isn't it great? But this is also another really useful lever around the importance of a new contract. And it further demonstrates the evidence that GMS from 2003 is just not fit for purpose anymore. It's not doing what we need it to do. We've recently had a local trust say we're not going to be doing any GP initiated bloods. And that's now leading practices to go tit for tat and go, right, well, we don't see how we're going to be able to do any secondary initiated bloods. And of course, the government, NHS England, the Department of Health are going to go, oh, but think of the patient at the heart of this. Well, if we were putting the patient first, quick little advert there for the GPC England vision, we'd actually be putting the money where the patient would really feel it. And that's in general practice. So the short answer is NHS England will go, not our problem, mate. And so will DH and so will government. But our argument nationally is that it is, because this is why we need a new contract. But also locally, be it the LMC, be it the ICB, there must be local discussions. And that's why it's so important that we can actually all look and see what we're getting. But it's not going to be the same everywhere. It's going to have to be horses for courses, because some localities will have different requirements for that population. But it also demonstrates the importance and the granularity of detail and the thought that has actually gone into local collective action initiatives. It's also, you can start with serving notice on those things that aren't commissioned. So you might have been delivering, I don't know, annual PSA monitoring for prostate cancer patients. And that might not be commissioned anywhere, but you've been doing it just through goodwill for many, many years. You can't suddenly stop, because that is like withdrawing a service. And if you've always been doing it, then the commissioner could potentially legally argue it's part of your custom and practice. So in that scenario, you need to, your LMC is in a really good position to be able to say, okay, you're doing this under protest in writing, like a blanket template letter. And then following on from that, you can then serve notice. How long that might be, 28 days, if it's not even commissioned, because there's no contract from which you could refer to, or it might be 12 weeks if you want to give your LMC longer to be able to negotiate something more substantive. But that's the kind of thing I'm talking about in terms of collective action and how it needs to work. And it starts with one practice going, do you know what, we're doing this, and telling their neighbouring practices. And sometimes it needs to be those bigger practices, because they often feel slightly more resilient and they're often under slightly more pressure to conform and be good boys and girls. But this is not going to be easy, guys. We're going to have to fight for our future.
Yeah, I want to talk about collective action in a minute, because I think this ties in perfectly with it. But to your point, a locally enhanced service is an optional extra, right? And so this is where, I still love being a GP partner. But one thing that I struggle with is, if you're just thinking about it from a business point of view, exactly what you said, Katie, income does not equal profit. So it doesn't matter if they're going to pay you 100 grand to do the service. If it costs you 150 grand to do it, you're losing 50 grand. You are taking 50 grand from your own pocket and giving it to the NHS and your patients. Very generous, but in the current climate, not sustainable in my view. And so what we teach on the Medics Money Partnership course is we've got a spreadsheet, you plug your numbers in, and someone offers you a locally enhanced service, and it's £45 to do 3 blood tests a year and a 15-minute consultation. Work out what the cost is, work out what your profit margin is, okay? And then from a purely business point of view, it's black and white. It's either profitable and you do it, or it's not profitable and you don't do it. What I personally struggle with, and perhaps this is why GPs as a cohort in the past have been not so good at this, is that I look at my elderly patients and I'm like, right, you got to go to hospital. It's a long way. You're like 90. Oh, do you know what? We'll just do that MGUS service. And, you know, the profit is 50p or whatever. And it's not profitable. It's not worth it. So the difference, you know, that's the thing where GP partners can struggle. And that's why I think you're right. Collective action is our chance to push back and say, this is our contract. This is our non-contractual stuff. We've calculated that this locally enhanced service is not profitable. So we're going to give you that one back. And we'll carry on doing these profitable ones. So can we talk about collective action? Because hopefully most GPs know that GPs are we're in industrial action right now, right? But maybe some other doctors don't. And I do hear a lot of partners sort of struggling on, so give me some tips on how partners can participate in effective industrial action.
So effective industrial action. So it's inform yourself. So go to bma.org.uk/GP contract, and you'll have various suites of resources there. There's a menu of actions. You can do one or as many as you like. They are all safe. They're all legal. You are not going to get remedial breach notices for doing them. We want you to talk to your patient participation groups, use the patient-facing materials we've produced. If you go bma.org.uk/GPs on your side, then a lot of the patient-facing material will come up, and please use that. And yeah, it starts with one action, which actually isn't a new action and doesn't even need to be industrial action. It is cutting your cloth to meet your costs, which comes down to safe working guidance and the worrying hamster wheel, where we often see those practices that fail are often the ones that are trying to deliver the impossible and do more and more and more. Yeah, we'll go total triage. Yeah, we'll keep on seeing more than 50 patients a day. Yeah, we'll make over 250 clinical decisions when we're a duty doctor. And oh, look at that, you spin faster and faster and faster, and then you splat off against the wall. You're under PHP, you might have a complaint, you're under PAG, then it gets referred to the GMC. These are potentially career ending or career changing sequelae from trying to do the impossible. Your contract, your GMS contract, does not tell you how many appointments you must see a day. It does not tell you you must practice total triage. It tells you you must meet the reasonable needs of your patients. And again, you know, negotiated back in 2003 when the average number of consultations per annum was just over 6. So things have changed, and people are now contacting their GPs on a much more regular basis because we are the first port of call. We're the only free professional advice to patients. And look at online services and what NHS England want. That's one of the actions. So you do not agree to have your online appointments switched on from 8 until 6:30 every single day, because you can't manage that. When you're full, you're full. And you have to then signpost back to 111 or to other local sensible services if they're commissioned locally. And that's not your problem. That is the problem of your commissioner. So safe working guidance is around 25 contacts a day. But you know what? This is a guidance and it's a journey. So if you're currently seeing 65, try seeing 50. You know, if you're seeing 50 patients a day, work down to 40. It's a journey. It's a journey of self-discovery. But we've got a brilliant safe working guidance handbook that's been written largely or by a massive team of people, but largely collated and put together and written and led by Samira Anand, one of my amazing deputies, and it is fantastic. But the original germ of thought of safe working guidance has actually been BMA policy since 2016. So this has been around a long time. We, in my practice, have been delivering safe working guidance since April 2020, and it has been it's been a complete game changer. And patients have more time, they present less frequently because they feel you've got to the end of the problems, you move to 15-minute appointments. A lot of people panic. We can't do that. You can, actually, you can do that completely permissively. And the government are anxious about this and they're selling it that we're making it worse for patients. You are not meeting your patients' needs now. You can't, because there's too few of us, there's too little resource. We've got 6.9 million more patients than we had in 2015. We've got 2,000 fewer practices than we had in 2010. We've lost thousands of GPs. The maths doesn't add up. And you are not going to be a genius who can change the laws of physics and be able to sort out the infinite within the finite. So that's a really essential part of our collective action. And it's also about safety. And you know what? Patient groups, they're actually behind it. National voices, they get it. They don't want to be the 63rd patient that gets seen. They don't want the decision fatigue GP. They understand what this means. This is about getting safe parameters in place and then building on the GP model. And that's what patients want. It's what patient groups want. So we are pushing in the right direction. We are the Jedi here, guys. That's the thing to remember. And all of the collective action points, you might have done some of them already. So one of them was the GP Connect issue, which everyone kind of like went bang one weekend in June, which I thought was amazing. And it was a really good portend of what's going to come. And it's okay if this takes you time and it takes meetings with your partners and your PPG and your staff to understand, because this is a marathon, not a sprint. Okay, this is not going to be action that we then suddenly call a halt to. This is totally different. This isn't strikes. This isn't a withdrawal of labour, because we're not one contract, one employer, picket lines, cover. We're a totally different model. We're pluralistic. There's 6,100 and 311 of us. You know, we've got to do it differently. So collective action looks different, and that's the menu. So please do go onto the BMA website, have a look. You can order resources, badges, lanyards, and every lanyard's got GPs on your side. And so every consultation has the reinforcement of that message. There are some really good videos as well to upload onto your screens, onto your website, onto your practice social media channels that tell the story in a way that patients can understand, that's visually appealing, and that basically says, look, we are collapsing. We have been broken. And the experience you're now receiving is because we're trying to do the very best with what we have. And it's 31 pence a day for you on average for patient care, 31 pence a day. So yeah, it was 30p, now it's 31p. That's the DDRB. But actually, we're going to have to be recalibrating this in line of the budget and looking to see what impact that's going to have, which is why any potential negotiation to put money back in isn't a negotiation. It's not new money. It's got to be about new resource.
Yeah, I think that's really, really helpful answer. And it's great as well, like you are a GP like us, you're explaining how you have implemented your own policies effectively in your practice. That's really helpful. I think like when I heard that GPs were going on strike, I was a bit concerned. When I found out it was collective action, and feel free to correct me, but collective action is essentially sticking to the terms and contract of our contract, right? So and stopping doing unprofitable services. So I was worried by a strike, but collective action is just like, well, we're sticking to the terms of our contract. I saw in the HSJ that the government estimates it's going to cost 570 million in 4 months. So what you're saying is we're about £1.5 billion short, because it's going to cost the government that amount over the year. And that's the amount of free work that we're doing. So yeah, collective action. I've used the resources at our practice, super helpful. Yeah, so check them out. And is that a fair, the strike is effectively not really, we're not downing tools, we're just saying we're going to stick to the terms of our contract and hand back unprofitable work.
Yeah, absolutely, Tommy. I don't tend to use the word strike, because strike often means withdrawal of labour, and this is far more actually working to your contract, no more, no less. So it's perfectly legal, but you're working to your contract. You're not delivering all that extra work for free, which you don't need to, which is actually creating issues for the viability of your own business. So yeah, that's absolutely, and there's a choice. There's always a choice, isn't it nice? We've got choices, and the choice is that the government could absolutely resource this to increase productivity and increase access and increase activity. Now, yeah, I'm sorry, my brain was going off in one direction traveling. That's probably a separate discussion entirely. But yeah, it only works if we do it. So if you're not doing collective action, you're not sure about it, inform yourself, go to the BMA website, start having conversations, speak to your local practice, speak to your friends, get onto your, WhatsApp groups of your colleagues, and start having those conversations. So, you know, there's recently been a letters come out from Optimize RX, one of the medicines optimization tools, because we've said, just ignore them, just ignore them. If it's just for cost cutting, ignore it. Now, you might have commissioned locally as part of your suite of locally commissioned services, medicines optimization agreements, which also include, and there might be some clinical reasons within that, but in many cases, there are none. In many cases, it's switch to this inhaler because it's the same as that, but it's going to cost us a lot less. But there's no clinical change. It's just cost cutting. And a lot of our systems depend on the changes that are like 30 pence, 6 pence at a practice level that translate into savings of millions at a system level. But none of those savings ever get translated into more investment into locally commissioned services for practices. And yet we've also seen deficits get written off for trusts. And so that's great for them, but what's coming to us? So I'm sorry, it's about ignoring those medicines optimization switches when it's just for cost cutting. And we've seen a letter to Northampton practices from Optimize RX saying, oh, you're going to be risking bad prescribing, risking GMC, risking all this. No, you're not, because that's already an obligation that you prescribe safely and reasonably and appropriately. And you might think about the cost, but no one's going to hammer you with a GMC referral if you don't change the prescription from one inhaler to another and it potentially costs the system £20, 20 quid. Sorry, what does an A&E attendance cost if they can't use their inhaler for COPD and they have an exacerbation and they have a non-elective attendance out of hours? Where is the genuine costing up of the impact on general practice? No one's doing it, so we have to do it. This goes back again. Sorry, I'm banging on Tommy. We can't, this is not going to be easy. We are going to have to make some tough decisions, but these decisions put the patient in front of you first. They're not creating a barrier between you and your patient in front of you, because anything that does that is a nightmare for us. So bring your patients with you, give them what they need and what they would prefer to have prescribed, because that's in their best interest. And all you can do is take a personalised care approach to the patient in front of you, because you do not have the resources or the skill to be able to give a platinum level service to every patient on your list, because that preserve is down to the ICB, NHS England, Department of Health, and ultimately Mr. Streeting himself.
Yeah, definitely. I find branded medications just taste better as well. Not medical advice, do your own research. We are getting close to time here and I've got a few more questions. And we've got a couple from the community as well, if that's okay. Andy, I think you're going to ask the next question.
Okay, so it's a pension. In terms of pension administration, this is probably the most common question we get about pension records not being up to date. So in other sectors, pension administrators face sanctions if they don't actually keep adequate records. So is this something that they should be considered in the NHS, and should sanctions be placed on the people administering the pensions to get things right?
Do you know what really boils my urine? It's when we have our contract, which is so carefully and closely and elaborately written. And I would say you can't break wind in general practice without there being a regulation or a statute behind it. And yet you've got the standard NHS contract, which is ignored constantly. And you've got other contracts with other private corporate providers. Capita is one of them. Many others are available, where you don't feel that's also being scrutinised or performance managed. PCSE feels like a shambles. It has felt like a shambles for a very long time. The BMA is on record as condemning them. I think the BMA is also on record as having requested the contract be taken from them and to be brought back into the NHS. And many of us were partners. I was a partner myself when we saw the dismantling of local commissioning units and people who had been working on pensions and performers lists, for example, for many years, who knew everybody and knew everything, and you had some degree of confidence that stuff would be done. I don't feel confident now. You know, I've just sent off my remedial statement to my accountant in terms of the McLeod remedy and everything else, and I've been assiduous in looking to see if any of my years in changing contractual status and changing amounts of entries in the pension has had impact, or if there's missing data. I've also got added years, and it's so complicated, and I know my stuff, and I find it really challenging. So God knows how anyone else must feel about this. It's like when, you've got friends who have to navigate the NHS and they're like, this is a nightmare. And you're like, I know. So I think one of the biggest challenges that actually GPs in England, and it's every GP, let's be clear, face is the out of date and inaccurate pension records. The missing years of pensions data is something that, you know, really should be keeping these guys awake at night. It genuinely makes me feel incredibly nervous and anxious. The scale of the problem, I fear, is likely to mean that it is a significant proportion. And I fear we're looking at many thousands of GPs affected. And the best way to know is to ask those questions. It's to make sure you've got your total reward statement, that you know what to write. So I don't know if you guys have any template letters that you share with people, say you need to send this. I mean, that's what I do, and I can share them as well, and we will. But the BMA Pensions Committee has been consistently highlighting the failures of Capita. It's a private company. It's contracted to deliver the work of Primary Care Support England. And the significant importance of those issues being resolved as soon as possible, especially with, you know, as I mentioned, the McLeod remedy decisions on the horizon. But the problem ultimately lies with the NHS BSA as the scheme administrator. And so the simple answer is yes, of course, there should be sanctioned for failure to keep accurate, complete and up-to-date records for a significant proportion of GP members. Imagine if this were patient records. Could you imagine the outcry? In fact, we've seen the outcry when it's thousands of patient records at a trust, but yet when it's ever one breach at a practice, we then see the Information Commissioner's Office. So don't start me on this, I'll never stop. But yeah, I mean, so the BMA has been lobbying the NHS BSA and lobbying PCSE to ensure this is resolved, and they continue to do so. And Vish Sharma was the Consultants Committee chair. He is now just the Pensions Committee chair, and he's got this between his teeth. So I think we're looking on the horizon quite imminently that if there's no meaningful progress, it's going to be escalated to referring cases to the pensions regulator, and I suspect that's probably going to happen sooner rather than later.
That would be good, because this has been rumbling on for a long time now. To your point about what can we actually do, inside the private community, we have a step-by-step guide on sorting this out. But because this is so important for all GPs, we have that in a YouTube version, publicly available on YouTube, with a step-by-step, like step 1, complain to PCSE. PCSE don't do anything, take step 2. Just because it's so overwhelming for GPs. So we've written that guide with the experts. It's helped loads of GPs now. It is available for hospital doctors as well. I'll put a link to the YouTube in the show notes so everyone can access that, because it's absolutely crazy that it's been going on for so long. And it's good to, like, let's get them in front of the Ombudsman ASAP. In any other industry, they would be in front of the Ombudsman, you know, for doing it. So it would be really good to see that. But in the interim, check out the show notes. Andy, maybe we could put your national insurance calculator spreadsheet in the show notes as well. That will help all GPs, not just those that are on the course. And I don't know how you're doing for time, Katie, but we've got 2 questions from the community. How are you doing?
I do kind of have a hard stop, so let's try and do them quickly.
One is just raising the point about national insurance. Dispensing practices have got more staff in general, higher burden, and will be hit harder. BMA got any plans to take that into account, or what's the plan?
I think for dispensing practices, it's particularly bad. And actually with dispensing practice, there's something important there around looking at your prescribing in terms of practice viability, and collective action is important around ignoring medicines optimization and dispensing what is going to be in the patient's best interest, but also your business best interest as well. So a really old friend of mine is Matt Isom, who's the chief exec of the Dispensing Doctors Association. He was on the GPC secretariat at the BMA for many years. He is immensely knowledgeable, and I would encourage all dispensing practices to join the DDA. And we work hand in glove, and Julius Parker, one of my deputies, liaises especially with Matt and the DDA board, and is taking all that forward. So yeah, that is a massive consideration. Julius is chief exec of Surrey and Sussex LMCs. He's got a big proportion of dispensing practices on his doorstep. So we are very alive to the particular issues facing rural dispensing surgeries. It has gone, and I think people very lazily assume that it's a big money spinner. It might have been once, it ain't now. So this is a really critical point, because in terms of the access to essential GP services and dispensing services in that rural location, it's absolutely paramount. So that's really high on our radar right now, just to give you some assurance, person on the call who's a dispenser.
Awesome. Give me like some kind of secret signal when the hard stop comes. Is there an appetite for government to offer new GMS contracts for GPs to set up practices in specific areas of low GPs? Is that something the BMA could consider asking for?
Absolutely asking for it. You will have seen on our Patients First vision that a new contract is one of our 3 must-haves. It's around increased resource per patient. It's around a new contract is, I think, the single biggest thing here. So if it's not working for a single department, or it's not working for patients, and it's not working for us, we need a new contract. The critical barrier here is Treasury, because put yourself in the mind of Treasury. From Treasury's perspective, we have never had as little and we have never done as much. Why will they want to change anything? So there's one thing about changing the hearts and minds of Stephen Kinnock or Wes Streeting. The real hearts and minds that will need change are Darren Jones and Rachel Reeves. And it's very hard to convince them to spend billions more on a new GP contract if at the moment we are delivering far too much for far too little. And that's, again, the importance of collective action. Because only until that trend starts to be bucked that we'll get the critical leverage that the DH can use and that Streeting can use to force the issue at Treasury. So yes, absolutely, we want to see a new contract. Now, this is the importance of the 10-year plan, and Sally Warren, who's been seconded from the King's Fund to the Department of Health, that's due to be published in spring, along with the next spending review, which is the critical spending review for 2 years. In that spending review, we have got to have a new GP contract. So our window of opportunity for leverage is now. So if you've been putting off collective action in the hope that something's going to come along anyway, you've got to do collective action. We've all got to put in as much effort as we can now to try and secure the holy grail of a new contract. That is absolutely imperative.
I think that's a great message to end on, a great time to end. I know we've got a few more questions in the chat, but Katie's been so generous with her time, and I know what a hard stop feels like. So thank you so much, Katie. We'll put all the links in the show notes. Thank you so much for everyone that came on the call as well and contributed to that. Hopefully that's reassuring. And yeah, really good to meet you, Katie. Sad that you couldn't come into London. And it's Wednesday night, which means sports night at the Union on Gower Street. So I'll see you there. Oh, no, wait, that was 24 years ago.
So sad. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tommy, and have a great one. And really, thank you very much for having me to come on. And we'd love to come on again. It's a brilliant podcast. I've been a fan for a very long time. Thank you so much.